Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 4,000 watt Coleman Powermate. It is powered by an 8-horse Briggs flathead engine and looks to be in excellent condition. There is minimal rust. It is complete. There are no missing parts. And from the looks of the exhaust, I would say this has seen very little action. The paint still has a really nice shine. Unfortunately, I don't know really anything about the history on this machine. My friend Jason dropped this off. He was hired to clean out a garage, and this was one of the items in the garage. The people who hired him also had no idea of the run status of it, but from the looks, I would say this was extremely well cared for and it's going to take very little effort to get up and running again. Now, I haven't done much to it other than pull it over. The engine spins without issue and it has compression. And I also took a look in the tank. The tank, thankfully, is not rusted out, but there is some old fuel in there. It is well past its prime, so we're going to have to clean that out. And according to the date code, this was made October 12th, 1987. So this is a 37-year-old machine. And from the looks of it, a very well cared for one. So yeah, let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. Let's check the oil real quick. Make sure we have some. And I am not seeing any. It should be filled up right to the last thread. I think it's empty. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything in there. Potentially there could be a little bit at the bottom, but it's well below the safe zone. So we do need to add oil. I'm thinking before we do that, let's just pull the plug, make sure every last bit is out, and then we'll start fresh. Yeah, it's a little bit. So this engine should take 1,100 milliliters, which is essentially filled right to the top of oil. And this is all that came out. I'm thinking this is probably about 300, maybe 400 milliliters. So we were significantly down on oil. And despite this machine looking so new, if this was run much longer, it would have blown the engine for sure. It makes me wonder why we're so low on oil. Potentially it was underfilled, or we have an engine that burns oil. And I'm thinking we have an engine that burns oil. This is actually the third 4,000 watt Powermate of this vintage I have worked on. And I use the term worked on loosely because the first two came in with holes in the side of the block. They had run out of oil, so I just ended up harvesting their generators and stuck them up on a shelf. So if for some reason this generator doesn't work, we do have a plan B and a plan C. But all I can say is if you have an 8-horse Briggs flathead of this vintage, you might want to check the oil because these do not have an oil sensor and clearly they have a problem consuming oil. So let's get this one filled up and then we'll move on. We'll get the old fuel drained out. And I think we'll do the easy thing. We'll just put some new fresh fuel in and we'll try to start it. I'm going to start by draining the tank And you can tell this has not been messed with. This fuel clamp, it is painted green like the rest of the engine. So this has never been removed. So the fuel line may not play nice here depending upon how petrified it is. And it does actually feel absolutely petrified. So I'm actually going to cut that off and we'll just put a new line in its place. And cutting it off is really the only option here. You know, when the fuel line becomes petrified, they don't come off the barb very well because it has to flex to come off the barb. And if it's petrified, you're not going to get any movement. Like right now, I'm pulling down on that line and you can see it is just rock solid. There we go. And thankfully, not a whole lot of fuel was in that tank. You know, the majority of it did come out, but it is still damp in there and just a tiny bit of debris. So I'm going to mop out what's left just to make sure that tank is spotless. Let's try to get this off without cutting it. You know, sometimes the barb on the carbs, it is made out of plastic, and the razor blade can cut it up pretty bad. So let's just pull the needle out. You know, if there's any fuel in here, we can drain it. You know, potentially it was stored dry, and the carb might be in good shape. And yeah, the threads look nice and clean. There's no corrosion and nothing drained out. So this carb potentially doesn't need to be cleaned. So let's add a new fuel line. We'll add some fresh fuel. Throttle plate's not stuck, so we'll pull it over a few times, see if it shows any signs of life. So we'll just cut up a new line using the old one as the template. So let's turn the fuel valve on. We'll give it a minute for the carb to fill up. Make sure the needle and seat work. And if they do, we'll try to start it. Well, it's been a few minutes and nothing is leaking out of that carburetor. So I'm going to get a light plugged in and turned on. We'll turn the choke on and see what we get. Gotta love these old Briggs. You know, I gave it a good 4 or 5 pulls with the choke on, and it was doing nothing, but I could smell fuel. So I turned the choke off, gave it maybe 2 more pulls, and this thing came right to life. Now, it was running really rich, so I did have to turn the main jet in a bit to get the engine speed to pick up. And then I fine-tuned it, and this thing ran absolutely perfect. You know, the engine sounded great, and we're making power. So this is going to be a quick video. I know, right? But it doesn't really need much more than a load test. You know, I did take a quick look at the filter. It's not in great shape, so we might get a new one of those ordered up. But I'm thinking, you know, for once, I may not have to clean that carb. You know, someone stored it dry. Someone obviously took care of this machine. So I say we just get a new filter on and get this thing outside, and we'll put it to the test. So it's a day later, and we got a new air filter from Amazon as well as a plug. So we get those installed real quick. This is probably the rustiest part of the machine right here. So I might take a second and just wire wheel that, try to get some of that rust out of there. So this was a tiny little Champion CJ8 plug that came out of there. You can see it's well used, and I don't think that was the right plug. You know, I did a little bit of research on this engine, and what I saw was that an RJ19LM is what should have been in there. So we'll double check the gap real quick. It should be right about 30 thousandths, and we're actually a little bit over at 34. So let's try to close that gap. And I overshot. We're now at 26, so yeah, it doesn't have to be precise. Actually, 26 is probably a little better than where it was. There we go. Right at 30 thousandths. In theory, this should be ready for testing. All we need to do is get this outside, let the engine warm up. I do need to fine tune the carburetor, and at that point, we should be able to load test this. That said, it's only Tuesday, and I do my load testing on the weekends, so we have a few days to kill. And since this video is so short, I'm thinking maybe we should get a jump start on the next video. I recently did a video on a Champion dual fuel generator that dropped a valve and caused a lot of engine damage. My hope was I could rebuild this engine, but being that it's a slightly odd size, I couldn't really find parts for it on eBay. And I checked the Champion website. Some of the parts were there, some of them weren't. And even the ones that were there, the cost was kind of borderline. I wasn't sure if it made sense to try to rebuild this. So, I set this aside and instead repowered that generator with a Honda GX390 and was a little bit disappointed because that engine fell a little bit short on horsepower, and I also found out it has a bad oil sensor. Anyway, as soon as that video aired, a Champion dealer reached out and offered to help. He said often dealers have access to parts that the public don't, so I gave him the list of parts I needed, and within a few days he had those parts in hand, sent them to me at cost, and well, here they are. So I need to prep the block for a rebuild. But before I do that, let's get the box open and just make sure we have everything we need. So that is the new cylinder head. We will take a look at that in a minute. New connecting rod. The original one actually survived. It was the dipper that broke off, so we needed a new one of those. A head gasket. Actually got two of those. And here is our new piston. No piston rings, but those I did order, so hopefully they're in one of the other boxes. Oh yeah, this giant box has a new wrist pin, some circlips, keepers, two new valves. I got a new intake and exhaust, and the set of rings. And then in here should just be the cylinder head. And yeah, it is a bare head. And there's actually no valve stem seal, so that I think is an oversight on my part. I don't think I ordered one of those. I do have some for Honda GX390 and clone, so I'm hoping that this one is close enough to a Honda clone. So let me grab one of those seals. Actually, before I do that, let's take the old head off. We'll take a look at what the old seal looks like, and then we'll pull out the Honda clones that I have, and hopefully they're the same. I only loosely put this back together so I wouldn't lose any parts. And we are going to have to reuse some of these parts, like the valve cover, the rockers, even the pins to hold the rockers, and this retainer right here. So we'll save that gasket. We do need to reuse it. I did not order a new one. Let's see how strong this spring is. We might be able to get that off without a compressor. Yeah, that seal might be a little bit different than a typical Honda clone. So, really, I should order a new one. You know, that said, though, this only had about 200 hours on it. And I am fairly certain the seal is good. I guess the question is, can I get it off without causing any damage? Yeah, I think this will be fine. The seal, it is still nice and soft. It's a very tight fit on the valve. I know I'm going to get a little grief for this, but, you know, if we find that the engine smokes, then we know why. Got two new valves and a new head. So these are machined to mate properly. You don't have to lap these in. And in fact, these valves, they are not magnetic. So you should never lap these in. Anyway, let's get them installed. I've already oiled up the stems. And we will start with the intake first. I pulled the valves back out because I realize it's going to be really hard to show you what I'm doing. So I'm going to show you right here before we do it for real. So these keepers, they are tapered. So there's a narrow side and a thick side. So the thick side goes up. There's a ridge on the keeper and a groove on the valve stem. And those have to line up so that the keepers cannot slide off of the valve stem. And then it's actually this retainer right here that's held up with the spring. And that keeps those keepers locked in. They can't come out. And that holds the valve so that it can't fall into the engine. right, there's one, and I'm using some grease here to kind of stick it in the right spot. And the trick is, once it's there, you need to make sure they stay in the right spot as you release the compressor. There's one. I think that's it. I'm just keeping a close eye on those keepers as I release this tool. And I want to make sure they stay locked in the right place, otherwise things could launch. Yeah, see, I don't like that. That is raised, whereas the other one is not. So I don't think that's in properly. So I'm going to double check. I ended up pulling the exhaust valve out. I wasn't liking what I was seeing. The original failure of this engine was the exhaust valve falling in to the engine. And I had assumed it was the keepers that had failed because the ridge had worn away. Well, we have new keepers, we have a new valve, but if you look at the level of the keepers versus the retainer, those keepers are raised, and if anything, it should be sunken into the seat like the intake valve is. So like this retainer can move around, and the keepers, I think you can see, are also moving around. So I think that is how the original keepers failed. It was the actual retainer that wasn't retaining properly. So yeah, I'm going to put the brakes on, reassembling the head. I do need to get a new retainer. This is the original one. And while I'm at it, might as well do it right and get the valve stem seal that we need. So I guess we're not quite done with the head yet. The new head did not come with studs for the exhaust or the intake, nor a gasket for the exhaust or the intake. So I want to make sure I can get the studs out and transfer it over on both sides before placing an order. And to do this, you just double nut it, and you tighten one nut against the other, and you want to use the inner one to turn it out. And this one I already broke loose, so I know it's going to come out. We still have the one down there, and the two studs for the carburetor. There's one. Oh yeah, that one's coming right out. So these are the studs I'm more worried about, just due to the length and the fact that it's a much smaller bolt. But it's the same process. You need to double nut it and then try turning it out using the inner nut. Oh, there we go. Much easier going in. So right now we're pretty much bottomed out on the threads. I'm just snugging it up. And that should be good. All right, I've got a couple updates. It's 24 hours later, and the first thing I did this morning was write an email to John, who is the champion dealer that is helping us out on this project. I described the problem, sent him a link to the video you just watched, and he wrote back kind of surprised. He asked if I had tried the aftermarket high-performance keepers that he included in the box, and I must have sat there for a good minute, probably looking like a deer in headlights, because I didn't see those keepers. So when I got home, I tore through the box, really wasn't seeing them. All I saw was what I thought were packing slips. This one was actually folded up, but when I opened it up, I could see that it was a note from John, and included were 4 aftermarket keepers. They were actually CNC machined from bar stock chromoly steel. They are hardened and black oxide coated, so they are much better quality than you would normally see in a small engine. They're actually meant for cars, for Honda engines. Anyway, at one point he had a similar issue before he was a dealer. He couldn't source the OEM parts from Champion, so he found these and actually has been using them ever since because they are so good. So I test fit them to the retainer that was giving us trouble, and I think you can see it is a much better fit. And I've actually already installed them on the intake. So, that got me thinking, why did the intake fit and not the exhaust? And as it turns out, the new Champion keepers I put over here, and the used, supposedly good ones I put over here, which obviously weren't good. So the good news is we have what we need. So let's finish up the exhaust valve. We will get the rockers installed, and move on. And that is how it's supposed to look. So if the keepers aren't sunken like it is right now, then something's wrong. And there was something wrong. So it would have dropped that exhaust valve again if I had left things alone. But like that and like that, I think we're going to be in pretty good shape. I know a few people commented on the teardown on this engine that they weren't crazy about this rocker design, but I actually think it's really good. Honda rockers and even Honda clones, the rockers, they are positioned by the push rods, and there's a little plate down there. So that plate often wears, and when that happens, the push rods can move out of place. So then the rockers move out of place. So this way, you actually have a pin so that the rockers cannot kind of twist away from that valve spring. So that's an important part. Keeps the pins from falling out. And I don't have very exact specs here for this engine. I do have plenty of kind of guidelines from Champion, which is what I'm going to be following to tighten these bolts. So I'm going to use a bit of thread locker, especially on this one since it's internal to the engine. We don't want it coming loose. And the last bit of prep I want to do is just clean the mating surface and get that cylinder honed. We have a new piston, new set of rings, and for an engine that dropped a valve, this cylinder made out surprisingly well. If you look real close, you can see plenty of crosshatch. There are some light vertical lines there on the bottom, but nothing that can be felt. So I think just maybe 30 seconds of honing should take care of that. If you look around, there are some other vertical lines, like there's one on the top left and a couple here on the right. And none of those can be felt with the exception of that one right there on the right. So, honing it, it's probably not going to fix that one, but it is going to minimize what's going on there. So before we can start honing, I do want to get the internals out. We have the camshaft, crankshaft, and counterbalance, mostly because when I go down with the honing stones, I'm going to hit anything that's in there. Plus, when we're done, we have to wash the block out pretty thoroughly. And, parts like that will rust up if they get wet. So nothing on this engine's been torqued properly. I just reassembled it loosely so I wouldn't lose any parts. That said, the flywheel still needs a puller. And that's all it took. Now the starter might prevent the flywheel from coming off, so we are likely going to have to remove that as well. Cleaned up a lot better than I thought. This is the right side where that scratch was that I could feel, and you can just barely see it. You can't actually feel it anymore. You know, all the marks on the top cleaned up, as well as the bottom rear. But there are, looks like 5 little marks right there, and I can't feel any of those. So I could hone it a little bit more, you know, and probably get that out, but I don't think that's going to be necessary. Both the cylinder and the block, they have been very thoroughly cleaned with soap and water. It's been blown dry, and everything important has been re-oiled. You know, the same has been done to the cover as well as the internals. So it's very tempting to put this together right now. But this video is not about this engine. This was just meant as prep. This will be a video all of its own. You know, this week's video is on this 37-year-old Powermate. So let's get this outside. Let's see if this machine can still pull its rated load of 4,000 watts. Yeah, I think we're pretty much ready to go. And it was a challenge to get everything plugged in because there's only 2 120 volt outputs. There are some 240 outputs, but there's no neutral wire, so I can't break it into its individual 120 volt components. So that rules out the load bank, but with this setup we can adequately test its max load of 4,000 watts. So I'm going to get the engine started. While it's warming up, I'm going to fine tune the jetting, and once we're good, I'm going to bring the load on. Each space heater on the ends will be turned on. Those are 1,500 watts each. So that'll bring us up to 3,000 watts. And then I'm going to put the middle space heaters on low. Now, those pull 600 watts each. So technically, we're going to be overloading this by about 200 watts. But I think it'll be able to do it. So let's get the engine started and see what it can do. can't tell you how refreshing it is to work on something like this. It's an easy machine to work on. It gets the job done. And I've worked on much newer machines recently that have just fought me every step of the way and were full of surprises during the load test. But not this one. It actually needed very little to get up and running again. It could pull its rated load of 4,000 watts, and we actually exceeded it and pulled 4,300 watts, and things kept running just fine. So although this machine is old, it doesn't mean it's bad, and in fact, I would say it's built better than most machines today. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.